Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Our guest today is Bernard Haykel, who's a prominent expert of the Middle East and a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Hello, thank you for being on the show.
Hello.
We would like to talk firstly about some of the news of this week and particularly the standoff in Egypt between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. Do you think that anyone is particularly benefiting from this deadlock? Is it one or the other side, or neither?
I think neither, and I think the problem with Egypt, whether it is for the military, for the Egyptian people, or for the Muslim Brotherhood, is this lack of constitutional framework, a political framework in which any of these people or actors can operate. So we don't know what the presidential prerogatives are. We don't know whether the parliament has or hasn't been annulled. It's not clear where the judiciary, where the limits of judicial power are, and the judiciary is clearly a remnant or a relic of the old regime, and as is the SCAF, the army, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. So this lack of clarity, this lack of stability, actually, is what it amounts to. Is, I think, very bad for Egypt. It's very bad for the Egyptian economy. We've seen already a dip in the stock market, and I can't imagine it being good for anyone in the long term.
Does it at least allow the Brotherhood to portray itself as defenders of the Egyptian people? Of course, it was a slightly different picture when they were in parliament and were accused of being rather more promoting of their own agenda, not a pan-Egyptian agenda.
I think they can make a claim to promoting the aims of the revolution, namely to really get rid of the old regime in its entirety. The problem, though, for the Muslim Brotherhood is that it's also creating instability, and I think that there's a limit to the Egyptian people's willingness to live with this instability, because there are real economic consequences and also security consequences to the instability. I mean, Egypt is a much more dangerous place on a quotidian, street level than it was in the past.
So people could get fed up enough to start demonstrating again against both the army and the Brotherhood, in theory.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's actually more a polarization of the Egyptian public between those who support the Brotherhood and those who support the army, not necessarily for love of the army, but because the army represents security, stability, a return of the old order.
What do you think is the general perception, though, of the Brotherhood today, ideologically? Do you think people have a sense of how it's changed or where it's heading?
I think that still remains to be seen. I mean, whether inside of Egypt or outside. In Egypt, you have the polarization. I think a large percentage of the population does not trust the intentions or aims of the Muslim Brotherhood. Others are willing to give the Muslim Brotherhood a chance to be in power to see whether they are true democrats or whether, in fact, they will revert to some sort of form of autocratic rule, but under a Muslim Brotherhood guise. And I think outsiders, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, I think are still in a wait-and-see posture as to whether the Muslim Brotherhood is able to bring about a true democratic transformation of Egypt, or whether, in fact, they might not revert to some form of autocracy that is comparable to what we saw in Iran once Khomeini took over power completely after the 1979 revolution.
So that worry perhaps explains why the West isn't backing civilian rule in Egypt, which you might expect them to do for democratic reasons.
Yes, I mean, there is the fear of Islamism. There's the question of what would happen to the peace treaty with Israel and whether the Muslim Brotherhood will stick to it or not. And I think there is general fear of chaos in the West, whether in Egypt or in the region. And Egypt is too big and too important a country to fall apart.
What's your sense of what's happening in Washington towards these changes, and whether perhaps there could be a rethink on relations with the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah, there is a constituency in D.C. that wants to rethink the relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, and there have been meetings with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think in those meetings, the Americans are basically saying, here are our red lines, as it were. Here are the things that we really care about. And we want you to stick to them and to respect them. And I suspect that the Muslim Brotherhood at the moment, since it's not fully in power, is saying, yes, we will adhere to them. Now, whether they really actually will in the end, I'm not sure. I have a question mark myself, because it might be possible for the Muslim Brotherhood to say, yes, we will adhere to, let's say, the peace treaty with Israel, but in fact end up backing Hamas in the way Iran backs Hezbollah in Lebanon. So in other words, using non-state actors against Israel or against some other foes, domestic foes as well, secular forces, for instance.
So the real motivation, you think, in Washington is fear of not being able to isolate Hamas. That's one common denominator,
Yeah.
regardless, obviously, of what constituency you're talking about.
Yeah,
in
I mean, I
Washington.
think that when it comes to Egypt, the Americans are concerned about Israel, first and foremost, and the peace treaty. Second, the use of non-state actors. Third, they want Egypt to remain in an alliance against Iran, and not to, as it were, play Iran against the U.S. or against Saudi Arabia. And I think they also want domestic stability. They want the Suez Canal to remain open. They don't want there to be a breakdown in Egyptian society, like something comparable to Somalia. That would be wholly unacceptable.
They want Egypt to continue to be essentially an anti-Iranian entity. Is the possible visit of President Morsi to Saudi Arabia, is that going to send the right signal then to Washington? They then say, okay, well, we can look more positively at the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes, I mean it's crucial that the first visit of Morsi, overseas visit, is to Saudi Arabia, and that's an important thing. It's an important signal. It's important for Egypt to not only show President Morsi in Egypt to show that it's still in an alliance with Saudi Arabia, but I think there are a number of other issues that have to be resolved in those meetings. The first is it's important for President Morsi to maintain Saudi interest and Saudi investment in the Egyptian economy and backing of the Egyptian economy, because Egypt does need Gulf money. It also is important for Morsi to resolve long-standing differences between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Saudi regime. And there was a break in the relationship after 1990, when the Muslim Brotherhood sided with Iraq against Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in that invasion of August of 1990. And the Saudis are not very happy with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're not supporters or backers of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's important that that relationship be mended. And I think it's also important for President Morsi to gauge Saudi support for the army as opposed to civil society and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So, whether the Saudis are willing to not blindly back the army in Egypt, but rather also back other forces who would act as a counterbalance to the army.
Is there any sign of where the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia might be moving on those issues?
I think the new crown prince in Saudi is, like his predecessor, most interested in stability and in continuity of the Egyptian-Saudi relationship and this axis against Iran. It would be crucial, I think, for him to gauge whether Morsi is willing to maintain that relationship, maintain an anti-Iranian posture, and whether, in fact, he won't try to outbid. Because the Muslim Brotherhood speaks in the name of Islam, just like the Saudi regime speaks in the name of Islam. And it's important that for the Saudis to see that the Muslim Brotherhood is not going to outbid the Saudis on Islamic legitimacy, on questions of Islamic legitimacy, that they will, in fact, adhere to a similar line, that the Saudi regime is a legitimate regime and not try to, for instance, promote anti-Saudi regime forces, many of whom are Muslim brothers, by the way.
It sounds like a real tightrope for Morsi, because he might have elements at home that would want a tougher line on Saudi Arabia than he can provide.
There are elements that are anti-Saudi in Egypt, and that are not just ideological, but rather have to do with a history of, in Egypt, a sense in Egypt that Saudis who have worked in Saudi Arabia as laborers at all different levels of Saudi society, from doctors to unskilled laborers, that they've been abused and mistreated in Saudi Arabia. And there are these repeated sort of causes célèbres cases where Egyptians are convicted for alleged crimes in the Saudi courts and often whipped and so on. And this generates a lot of anger in Egypt against the Saudi regime.
Bernard Haykel, I'd like to ask you one element about Libya, which of course has just held an election. do you think that we're seeing an increasingly diverse Muslim Brotherhood as an idea in these Arab Spring countries, with these two different currents in Libya, but within that, lots of diversity within the two main parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Muslim Brotherhood, whether in Libya or in Tunisia or even in Egypt and elsewhere, has never been a unified movement, a movement that has a very strong discipline in terms of ideology or in terms of political practice and tactics. It's been a fairly broad tent movement. And in Tunisia, for instance, you see a Muslim Brotherhood that is very closely allied not only to Qatar, but also to Turkey, to the AKP in Turkey, and is trying to model itself after the AKP in Turkey. In the Libyan case, I don't read the Libyan situation, the political situation in Libya, in terms of ideology or in terms of a spectrum of ideology from Islamism on the one hand to liberalism on the other. I don't think those labels mean much in Libya. What matters in Libya is tribal identity, regional identity, city identity. So, people are divided not necessarily along ideological lines, but rather along regional and tribal lines and a sense of solidarity.
And of course, let's not forget, it's the first election in decades, so it's an experiment which resists these labels of Islamists and liberals. Right. We're going to have to end it there because we've run out of time. Thank you so much for being on the interview, Professor Bernard Haykel from the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University in the United States. Thanks for watching.